Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about my rankings for the first round of the Booktube Prize Award. I will link everything down below. There is a channel and a website and a bunch of stuff that you can go check out, but these are the 6 books that were in my group and my personal rankings for all of them. I'm going to go from my least favourite to my most favourite, so suspense for what keeps my number 1 slot. There was really only one book from this entire collection that I very viscerally disliked, and that book in particular is Laura Cumming's On Chapel Sands. This is also known as 5 Days Gone in the American version, if you have seen it around from some other people, but in the UK it's called On Chapel Sands. So this is the story of Laura Cummings' mother, who when she was a young girl, around 5, she went missing for several days. She has no recollection of this and her family kept it a secret from her. This is the story of her mother trying to, finding out that this happened to her, and then it is her mother and Laura trying to find out why it happened, what happened in that time period, and general stuff around the family. However, this is at least what the book says it is on the blurb. In reality, what this book is essentially a family drama with very little meat to it that is padded out to around 300 pages worth of fairly nonsensical rambling that no one cares about. Basically, there are weird musings on art and life and her mother and the British Constitution and what it means to be British and how we keep things inside and dysfunctional families, and it goes into a very long backstory about her grandparents and her great-grandparents, and the whole thing comes down to basically a custody battle and a bit of a torrid family secret that was kept from her mother, and that's about it really. I cannot begin to articulate properly how little I cared about anything happening in this book. I know that this book has been very, very well received, and I don't get it. This was one of the most boring reading experiences of my entire life. I tried to read it in physical form, and at around the 40 to 50 page mark realised that it'd take me about 2 weeks to get to that point, and I was so sick of it, so I downloaded it on audiobook, chucked it on 1.75 speed and just let a chipmunk tell me her story. I was done. If this hadn't been for the Booktube Prize, I would have DNF'd it. If this hadn't been for the Booktube Prize, I never would have picked it up. I am not the target audience for this book. This is for people who like family dramas or really are into very lyrical writing, neither of which I particularly tick that box for. This book sucked and I endured it. That is all I can really say, and some of you might say that that's a bit harsh, but I will caveat all of this by saying, I never thought I was going to enjoy this book. I never wanted to read this book. This book did exactly what I thought it was going to do, and funnily enough I didn't enjoy that, so sorry. From this point on, I generally enjoyed the majority of my reading experience for the books. It now just comes down to how well I think they executed whatever it was that they were attempting to achieve. We're now going to move on to the next book, which is The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri. This is a book about what it is like to be a refugee. Dina was a refugee when she was a young girl. She fled from, I believe it was Iran. I'm sorry, I read this way back in the beginning of February, so this is one where I'm the most hazy on my memories of the reading experiences, so I am referring back to some of my notes kind of thing. The book talks a bit about her own personal experiences, looking at refugees in general and the process of being a refugee and what does it kind of mean and the reasons why someone would flee a particular area. It is mainly focused on people fleeing, vaguely trying to come towards America, because that was Dina's own personal experience. It looks at the current refugee situation as well as what they were like when she was a refugee, and also the kind of process of assimilation into your new home country, and the process of being kind of accepted, and that dual identity that you're dealing with. It was generally a very interesting book that had really, really key chapters that stood out to me as being very fascinating and important and very interesting to learn about, but huge chunks of it for me just were her own personal story rather than a kind of broader discussion of what was happening. I felt like the chunks about her own story were too long. The more macro sense of what was happening kind of got a bit lost for me, and there were sections where she talked to other people about their experiences being refugees, but they felt like they were a little bit crowbarred in. And for some of these people, we actually ended up meeting them later when they became important, because they got into work within the refugee crisis in some kind of way, but I didn't think it was very clearly signposted when these people were going to become relevant again, and it was frustrating to kind of have their narrative and their story told in far more of a kind of conventional, almost fiction style. And then when we came down to later Dina talking about going and talking to these people, it was harder to like piece that they were the same person. The bits that really stood out for me though were the discussion predominantly on charity and what it means to give charity in a way that means that the person receiving the charity gets to keep their dignity. And I thought that that was a really, really powerful part of the book. I kind of feel like this book almost would have been better in a collection of like essays rather than as the whole thing as it was, or like ripped apart and been just her story or just some of the other things. I wasn't happy with what she was doing structurally speaking, and it's really hard to put a finger on exactly why, but for me that was what it was lacking in. But it was genuinely a very interesting book. The next one, so this is now on my 4th ranking place, is, as she says as she grabs it, Savage Appetites by Rachel Monroe. This is 4 true stories of women, crime and obsession, and this book was probably the one that I knew the most about going into it just from like chatter on Booktube. This is a book looking at people's obsession with true crime, specifically women's obsession with true crime, and why it is that we get so into true crime. We meaning in a collective sense, not including myself in that. This is another book that like I really don't think I would have ever picked it up had it not been for the Booktube Prize, and I don't think I was fully its target audience. So the 4 true stories are focused on like the 4 different ways that people can kind of, or that Rachel Monroe has identified that people can connect with some kind of true crime story in some way. So we have the detective, the victim, the defender and the killer. Just checking I got that right. For me, the strongest section was on the detective. So the detective section talks about a woman called, I believe, Frances Lee, who actually was one of the very like early pioneers for forensics, and she made these tiny little dioramas that were different potential crime scenes and used them like as a teaching method for like detectives and cops out there. And up until that point it'd been very much like detectives kind of working on gut instinct and a couple of eyewitnesses and hoping for the best. So this idea of having something a little bit more structured and scientific that you could work back from, she really pioneered that and did a lot of work with the FBI on that. That was really interesting. And then for me, the other 3 chapters just kind of lost it. And for me, my issue with true crime, and the reason why I don't tend to read much true crime, is it feels very voyeuristic in a way that I feel very uncomfortable with. This is not meant to offend anyone who is very into true crime, but for me, my understanding of how people approach true crime is it tends to toe the line far too closely between being like interesting information then going into like sickeningly relishing the gory details of a particular case, and I feel like this book really towed that line, and it was almost like Rachel Monroe was too close to the thing that she was trying to talk about to be able to talk about it objectively. So I took real umbrage with 2 particular chapters of this book, which, given that that is 50% of the book, that's a bit of an issue for me. One was the section about the killer, and it discussed the obsession we have with Sharon Tate, and again we meaning kind of a collective rather than me personally, and the Manson murders and like the obsession with what happened there to the person, and like the way that victims just become like props in their own experiences basically, and their own stories. And the issue I really had with that was that Rachel Monroe was kind of critiquing the way that they get used and kind of glorified, and the like insane amount of detail that gets told about their final moments and how they get reduced down to this. But then she referred to a particular teenage girl who'd gone missing when she herself was a teenager, and the obsession that Rachel had with her MySpace page and trying to like find out more about this poor girl. But she uses the full name of the girl in the book, and in doing so it just felt like she'd done exactly to this poor girl and this poor girl's family what she was critiquing people for doing to Sharon Tate and Sharon Tate's family. And it just felt for me very very like blind and very kind of hypocritical without sort of really realizing it. And then later on it discusses in the section about killers and the kind of idolization that people have for certain killers, and it references in particular Columbine and the school shooting there, and discussing the kind of misinformation around that and the way it has been glorified in the media, and the way that a lot of the underground internet subcultures have really latched onto this. But in doing so, she discusses the way that the media mishandled the information, but then she gets some really kind of key facts about the case wrong. And the only reason I know this is because I just read a book on Columbine. I will link the video down below. I think it's in my February wrap up, where it was a very intense reading experience, but like it's the book on Columbine from the leading expert, which has been out for over a decade. And I just feel like it's sloppy for Rachel to get some facts wrong in a book, in a chapter, discussing part of it being the media's misrepresentation of how that went down. And maybe I'm being nitpicky, and maybe I'm being niggly, and maybe it's just that I'm not the target audience for this book, and like I don't get true crime. And I'm not saying that she isn't discussing some interesting things, and I think if you are more into true crime you might enjoy this a lot more, and you might be able to find a lot more from it. And I do think it as a discussion as like what is our obsession with it kind of societally wise is fascinating, but I don't think this book necessarily does it very well. I don't think Rachel Monroe was necessarily the best person to write this book, and I think that given that this is a kind of new field, I can't remember who the quote is from, but you know, you can either be the best or the first in your field, and I feel like Rachel Monroe has just benefited from being the first, which means that she really isn't the best. So I hope that makes sense and isn't slamming this book too much, because I do think that there are sections of it that are very cool, but for me half of the chapters just didn't land and left me with like an icky feeling inside, and I don't want to read books for an icky feeling, so that's why it's fourth. My third place goes to No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Snyder. This is a book about domestic violence, specifically in America, and I thought that this was such a well-structured book and did such a good job with a really difficult topic, and I'm very impressed with Rachel Snyder's writing style. The top three on my list I actually gave 9 out of 10 to, all three of them. I think that they were incredibly strong non-fiction books, so kind of almost consider these joint, but I did have to rank them, and the reason this one is in third rather than second or first is that it's a very difficult topic. So just personally from my own reading experience, I found it very hard to read in times because it is discussing domestic violence and it occasionally got a bit more graphic than I could personally handle. In turn, I think this is so well done is I thought that the way that Rachel structured the book was absolutely fascinating. She takes on like 3 major chunks of kind of how you can approach domestic violence as an issue, and specifically discussing domestic violence linked to women. It mainly focused on women dying basically, and it's not just looking at kind of cases of women being beaten, but it's that escalation to where they are predominantly shot because it's in America, and it was looking at that escalation of what can you signpost up to it, that discussion of like what can you do to work with men who have these tendencies to try and stop it before it gets to that point, and what can they be doing in terms of providing support for women in the during process of before it gets that bad. And I thought that it was just so clever with the structure. I loved the middle section where it's discussing like how can we stop men from beating women and wanting to kill women, because so much of the discourse around like women and violence tends to be focused on like how can we protect women better, how can we stop them from being in difficult situations, how can we remove them from this, and instead to have a huge chunk that was like how can we stop men from lashing out, and how can we deal with the violence that's here, and what can we put in place. And it wasn't just like, oh, gun control, there you go. Like it was really looking at what programs there are which are being done either in prison or outside of prison to work with people so that they don't end up offending again in the way that they do. And I think that that's just such a strong and powerful way of doing it, and it made for a very uplifting section of the book because it felt like it was really dealing with some of the underlying issues rather than just trying to like deal with it was like a cause thing rather than just the symptoms. Like I say, it was difficult to read in places because it did get a little bit, not even so much graphic, but it focused in a lot on some families in particular and their story, and for me it just went that step too far that felt for me personally a bit voyeuristic. And I know that I have a harder line than a lot of people on what I do and don't like to read in that way, so a lot of people will probably be fine with it, but for me personally it just kind of left me again feeling a little bit icky that I didn't like. I felt like I was intruding, and also it's entirely American centric, which is not the fault of the book, but I personally would have liked something set in the UK, so I should probably go out and read something set in the UK. It also just doesn't really discuss men and domestic violence against men. It's very much like focused on women as the victims, and in a very like heteronormative slant. There might have been the odd bit referencing it, but if there was, it's so little that I can't actually remember it. So just be aware of that going in. I think it's not necessarily a problem for it though, because non-fiction should, I think if it's being good non-fiction, limit its scope to something that is reasonably able to be tackled in kind of, you know, 250 to 350 pages. Otherwise you're just trying to take on like a whole vast array of information that you just can't do. And actually, statistically speaking, more men beat up women in hetero relationships than in any other kind of combination of those, just from like sheer stats. So it's a big one to talk about and tackle, and it's a good one to give an example of, because a lot of the things that they're talking about can obviously be applied across. I'm sorry, I'm very popular today. I should probably put that on mute, shouldn't I? Can obviously be applied across these different settings, but it is worth acknowledging that it is taking a very heteronormative stance on this. If that is something that you're going to find frustrating, just know that going in. The next one was slightly less heavy, which was quite nice, or heavy in a different way, and that is The Ice at the End of the World by Jon Gertner. This is a book about Greenland, the history of Greenland's exploration, and what we can learn about the ice in Greenland from a kind of climate and science perspective. Science perspective. Top quality there, Emma. So the first half of this book is very much looking at the history of exploration in Greenland and the different advances in technology. That means you can have different ways of exploring, and you know, the very first people to be able to cross the ice and how they did that back in the like 1800s, to then the ways that we kind of travel across it now, and then it very much moved into modern day and what we're trying to learn from the ice and the various different ways it's been funded, and just kind of the different science that's going on that can then shed lights on things like climate change, and what is happening, and the way that the ice can signpost bigger things going on in our kind of like global ecosystem. I think Jon Gertner does a phenomenal job. Clearly it's number 2, it's a 9 out of 10 as well, a 9.5 out of 10 if I can even do that, like 4.75 stars. I loved this as a reading experience. I really like kind of sciencey books and like naturey books and exploration-y books, so this ticked a lot of boxes for my own personal reading taste, and going into it, this was the one that I was most confident I was going to enjoy, so I'm very pleased that it is indeed my number 2. In terms of just like why it isn't number 1, it was just that it was very dense in places with the amount of science. I don't think that this is a very beginner friendly book if you're not comfortable reading about scientific terms, and I think that it's very dense. I could only do maybe like 10 to 20 pages a night on this, which for me is not very much reading, because once I'd hit that point, my brain would be like, okay, that's like enough information for now, we need to stop, and I'd just kind of start skimming things. So that was the only thing that kind of slowed it down a little bit. I don't really have a crazy amount to say about this, because it's not dealing with like big scary social justicey things. It does talk about climate change, but not in a like scary this is what we should be doing kind of way, because there are other books out there for that. This is just kind of signposting like, look, Greenland and ice and like history of exploration in it, and look at how much useful information we're getting. And like, it does get a little bit towards the end about kind of what you can do, etc, etc, the state of the world right now kind of thing, but it's just generally talking about like, this is some cool science about, and like this is how the study of, is it like glaciology, is that what he called it? I can't quite remember, but like the science of ice as a thing distinct from like geology and geography in general became a thing. So from like a history of ideas perspective, this was really, really cool, and just generally good fun, and it was really nice to read one that was a little bit more fun, even if the science itself was very dense. So yeah, very, very, very good. Okay, and then the last one, which is my number 1 pick from my group, is How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. This I read and finished this morning. Didn't just like read this morning, but you know what I mean, I finished it this morning, and I don't think that has skewed my opinions on it, because I finished it so recently. I genuinely believe that it is the best structured non-fiction of all of them. This book is kind of a bit of a mix of a memoir as well as that racism, and a lot, it was doing a lot more kind of conceptual stuff than I think a lot of the other books on this list. It wasn't doing too much with kind of statistics or very specific examples. It was discussing more the concept of racism, and what does it mean to be a racist, what does it mean to be not racist, and what does it mean to be an anti-racist, and the idea that these are terms which actually not racism is just as bad in a lot of ways as racism, and that anti-racism is the only way that you can really see any genuine progress. The structure of it was incredible. It was so like clearly, meticulously well thought out. Each chapter discussed a different way that racism can intersect with something else. So whether it was discussing things like racism and gender, racism and like sexuality, it had a whole chapter on like light and dark racism, and the idea of like sort of inter-black racism, like black on black violence, and the idea that if you are light as a black person or dark as a black person, and kind of the issues in that. It made some really good distinctions between segregationism, abolitionism, and then true anti-racist ideals, and the way that a lot of the work that has been done in the past, whilst is obviously better in some ways than just like straight segregation, is still harmful in a lot of ways, and that kind of the climate of how we talk about race and racism has got very, very toxic in a very, very different way. This is going to be the kind of thing where I think like I'm probably going to be explaining it very badly, because it is dealing with such like highbrow concepts rather than specific examples. I loved the amount that Ibram included his own life in it, because for me it was the perfect amount of like, this is a very specific instance that is highlighting and is helping to explain a much bigger thing that I want to talk about, without it becoming overbearing or too much of a memoir. It did track through his life really nicely. It was lovely to kind of grow with him, and sort of see his journey through understanding his own ideas about race, but it didn't go to a point where it was so much that like it felt like it was just his story rather than the much more macro highbrow stuff that he was talking about. Ibram is actually an academic as far as I could tell, and you can really tell that in his writing, because it was so like clearly signpost what each individual section was going to be talking about. One of my notes from this is I wish everyone wrote like him for my degree, because I think he would have made so many of the concepts in philosophy like make way more sense, because it really was such a like clear structural thing that he was doing, and I think it's just such a well done piece of writing. I don't really have a crazy amount more to say about it. Again, this was like a 9.5 out of 10. I don't really know if there is anything in particular stopping it from being like a full 10 out of 10. I think I kind of just need to sit with this one and the Eyes to the End of the World, and maybe even No Visible Bruises, and just kind of see if I think that they go all the way up there or not. But I'm probably going to give all three of those 5 stars on here. But I think for me, the real craft that Ibram is showing in his writing is the clear reason why this one is the winner out of my particular section. Obviously talking about a very important thing, clearly, but for me personally, just because you're discussing something important doesn't give you a free pass that you automatically are doing something worthwhile with your writing, if that makes sense. And I think Ibram had the perfect blend of like, this is a very important issue, clearly, but also you're doing it in a fucking good way. Like you so know what you're doing when it comes to your writing. So yeah, so holy crap, this was a long video, but I had like a lot of thoughts about a lot of the books. I'm quite excited about round 2. I am hoping they might be slightly easier to read, but I was pleasantly surprised by some of the books on this list. Like the How to Be an Anti-Racist was actually a much easier read in a lot of ways than I thought it would be, because it wasn't like going super hardcore into the statistics that just make you feel really fucking bummed out about the world. And don't get me wrong, those statistics have a place, and like No Visible Bruises used them a lot and used a lot of very specific examples, which is important, but from like a just reading perspective, especially with what's going on in the world right now, like I can't handle knowing how many women die from domestic violence. Like sometimes you have to protect yourself as a reader as much as you like want to educate yourself on these things, and I'm hoping that round 2 will have fewer books that make me wake up screaming because they're so traumatic. So yeah, so that's my plan. So do let me know what you think to these. Do you want to add any of them to your TBR? If you were in my group, did you agree with my rankings? Like I'm so interested to see, because everyone loves On Chapel Sands, and I bet I'm like one of the only ones to put it as the bottom one on the list. So yeah, let me know all your thoughts and how you're doing in general. Have a wonderful reading week, and I will chat to you soon. Bye.